So that's how these slides are done properly, Stephen. I want to tell you a funny story about him, actually. We were talking about how these conferences are important to talk to the people who actually talk. And I did a keynote at Eurostar last year, and at the drinks afterwards, never met Stephen in my life. He walked straight up to me and he says, "How do I know you're not full of So that's one approach. But I think there's other ways you can do that, but it's really important to have the discussions around this. So I'm not going to talk about testing today. I'm going to talk about how to talk about testing to a certain segment of the population. So prepare to get a little meta here. So to give you some context, for about the last 15, 20 years, I've been running large-scale testing operations for multinationals, either banking, financial services, or insurance. And my last role at Barclays, before I just left to start a company, was at the end about 1,700 testers across multi-asset classes and businesses. And within that, so my context, there's usually a corporate structure, and at the top of that structure is some C-level person who's making all the decisions around technology, products and services, and they're a good person to be able to influence. And I get asked a lot, because I usually have regular meetings with them, what do you talk to these people about? What do you, tell them about software testing? So today, I'm going to try and relate a little bit of that to you. It's more of an experience report than anything else, which is great for me because you can't say I'm wrong. So with that, off we go. Yes. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, why would you even want to talk to a CIO, CEO, CTO? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Because I lost you today. That's one reason, right? I gave you the answer earlier. So I'm in the enviable position of being the last talk before beer. So I'll try and get through it. But the why you'd want to talk to them is because they make all the decisions around products and services and IT, and they can directly impact your life, which is why you see things like, the CEO I was talking to the other day, actually was the CEO of a large multinational. We're consolidating all our testing into a big tier 1 vendor, right? And when that happens, 2-3 levels down in the organization, suddenly they start popping up all around you, and the next thing you know, you're trying to teach them how to do your job somewhere else, right? So it's important to want to influence their decisions. The framework I put around when I interact with them is basically two-part. I want them either to know something, it's real complex, right? Or I want them ultimately to do something, right? And if you can keep it into those two simple categories, it will help time management and everything else. But there's some things you need to remember when talking to somebody who's running a large-scale operation. First one is, they don't care about your problems. And I see a lot of software testers who are just kind of a whingy bunch in general, fall into problems here, but just people in general, right? They've got all sorts of other things on their mind, and ultimately, if you're going to take the opportunity to talk to them, and I particularly love when it happens in a public forum like a town hall or something like that, to complain about the cafe, or my other favorite one is complaining about our comp structure, right? That's probably not going to get you the best result in terms of endearing yourself to anybody, because they've got, they don't really care about your problems. They might care about what you're doing if you can tell them why, but they don't really care about your problems. The other thing to remember is they got their own problems, right? Everybody's got their own problems. And they may know things about the business, about technology decisions, about finances that you may not know about, that aren't public, which greatly impact their ability to run the organization. And I think as well, the last part here of the 3-part strategy for how to frame these things is, ultimately no one cares about your problems, right? So trying to avoid the special little snowflake syndrome a lot of people subject themselves to, taking the opportunity to try and get them to solve your problem isn't probably the best use of anybody's time. So bear that in mind. And one of the things that I've experienced again and again when talking to CEOs and CIOs is that one of the things that they want, and they're conditioned to think testing is going to give them is confidence. And I've spoken and written a bit about this, which I think is an inappropriate objective for testing, but it's not a bad thing in general to want. They don't know everything that's going on in their organization, and they want confidence in their decisions. They want confidence in products and services and people. When it comes to testing, something they want confidence in is, have we tested this thing the right way? Have we had enough coverage? The problem is that runs directly into what I think is oppositional to the objective of testing, because it will break their heart. And ultimately, we've got people like Dick here who keep telling us things that are true, like, you can't ever be sure you're right. You can only ever be sure you're wrong. So when they talk to people in a testing organization, we start breaking down all those little paradigms that they have about how the world's supposed to work, and it makes it incredibly frustrating for them when we start whinging on about either metrics or test cases or all this bunch of stuff that's very negative in their mind. They don't have a tester to senior manager translator. So the problem with talking to people, particularly at the C-level, about quality, and this is going to get very technical here, so I'm going to delve into what Mark was talking about earlier on the psychology of it. Again, it's kind of a three-part problem. The first one is they suck at it, right? So when you're going to ask people about quality, particularly CEOs, they've probably never been asked that question before. They aren't thinking about it. They don't really know how to express it. And no one has probably couched it in terms that make any sense to them. So I'll give you a perfect example. Just a couple weeks ago, I was talking to a CEO of a great company, and we're talking about what we can do to help them on their testing. And he instantly went into, we've got to automate, most of this stuff. We've got a 40% reduction in operational costs I need to achieve, and blah, 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 blah. And I was, hold on, Hoss, right? What are the big problems that you might do to your clients if things go wrong? What does good look like for your company? I hadn't really thought about that one. And that fundamentally changed the conversation. We can roll it back and have a more meaningful conversation about what quality actually means. But we don't talk about that, and they absolutely don't talk about it. Because the reason why they don't talk about it or get asked about it is because the second part of this problem is we suck at it, right? As an industry, we're terrible at this. If you get most testers in a room with somebody, they're going to start talking testing lingo, and nobody can do the translation. And a big part of where my experience with senior people get their information about testing are terrible sources of information. They've probably had all the top tier vendors in their office telling about their defect predictinators, their algorithmic, bug calculators. There are a bunch of crap that doesn't exist, but, my 10,000 certified testers, right, that falls into the category of what I call wish thinking. It sounds really good. Man, do you want it to be true? But wanting it to be true doesn't make it any more true, right? So they get information from all sorts of really bad places. And if you're a test manager and a vendor is talking to you, don't think for a second that person is actually selling to you. What they're doing is market research. So when they go meet with your CEO or COO or CIO, that's who they're selling to. That's why suddenly you've got a new tool in place or a new vendor in place. So be wary of that. And the last reason here is always being very self-reflective. If you can guess what it's going to be, you suck. And the reason why you do is because you don't spend enough time talking about this. And I give testers that I do training with what I call my impact test. And very few are able to do it. And what I say to them is, if our CIO walked in today, right now, and said, you tell me the last critical defect you found and what its impact was going to be the production environment and what it would do to our clients, stand up and tell me right now what that is. If you can't do that, you're not thinking holistically about why you're testing, right? We build software and products for people to use and businesses to support. If you don't understand things that you're observing and information you're getting and how it's going to affect the overall business, you don't have a holistic view of why we're testing, right? So those are the three big problems there. And a lot of it's driven by this idea that quality equals no defects. And we in the testing industry are just as responsible for that. Quality does not equal no defects, but we tend to talk in those terms. You can, as the adage goes, a test can pass and there still be a problem, right? What you observe, all the interesting stuff that happens around that is what you can actually action some intelligence off of. Because there's lots of things that impact value. And if I can use the Weinbergian model of value, quality as value to some person. Did you like that, Ian? Weinbergian? Thank you. Ring the bell. At value being, quality being value to some person, there's lots of stuff that impact that, right? And you need to understand what that is in the context of your business and how to derive that, because people aren't talking about it. So one of the models that I've used repeatedly to prepare for a conversation when I'm either called into an exco, some kind of senior management meeting to talk about what we're doing and why we're going to justify spend, is to try and put it into this model. And if we use, James's definition of testing as questioning a system in order to evaluate it, a very MBA-ish management consulting model is this kind of cost, quality, time triangle. And that is something that, is repeatedly used again and again. And how I try and condition myself and work with testers to do this when they have to go justify a budget or spend is when we're talking about quality, right? Try and be as accurate as possible. And what's the best way to find out what people mean by quality? Ask them, exactly, right? That's part of the reason why we suck is we don't ask them enough, right? So when you go find out what people mean, your developer's vision of quality is probably something that hangs together long enough so they can get it in the release cycle and get their bonus, right? That's probably their view of it. The project manager might have a different view. The product owner, the business might have a different view of what quality actually means. So try and be as accurate in that and congruent with those different views is important. Cost, in terms of this triangle, I look at transparency, and that's not some kind of BS ROI calculation, because I think most of that stuff is pretty flawed. That's really about letting people know what things cost. People cost money. Tools cost money. Time costs money. Letting people see how much it's actually going to cost to do something. I have said probably repeatedly in my career, if you want to save money on testing, do less of it, right? That's a good model for that. And in terms of time, we want to be as efficient as we can with what we have. Resources are given to us. They can be taken away as well. So trying to be as efficient as they are. And out comes the back of that, a bunch of stuff that we can tell people, right? Defects being only one part of that, or bugs, issues and risks being where the interesting things are. So about a year ago or so, Michael Bolton turned me on to this book called Rethinking Expertise. It's written by Harry Collins and Robert Evans, the guys who wrote Tacit and Explicit Knowledge. And in the book, they define expertise as existing along a continuum, where on one side there's kind of, bar, knowledge, what you can talk about with your friends from the news. And then on the other end of the continuum being contributory expertise, meaning you're actually contributing to the advancement of the science or the knowledge and adding to the actual knowledge base. And somewhere in between there, and my view is it kind of floats and hovers around those, is what they defined as interactional expertise. At the risk of insulting you, I'll read it. So it's expertise in the language of a specialism in the absence of expertise in its practice. Now, one, that's a great book you should read just in general. It'll help you communicate ideas better. But two, I think in terms of talking to people, particularly ones that don't understand your field of discipline, understanding what they do enough so that you can speak their language, but also be able to help influence the decision is really important. So I talk to people who work in bond trading different than people who talk in equities, who talk to different businesses. I talk to a developer different than how I talk to testers, to try and help influence their decisions, but enough so that I've got credibility with them. The two things about this is that, one, it's learned behavior, so you can learn it. The problem with it is that it's not transferable. So I can't teach you, right? And I had this ongoing conversation with Michael for a while about this, and I think it comes down to, like, if people were doing it, if they understood this, they were already doing it, which is kind of my Darwinian opportunism that when people ask me, well, how did you get that job? I'm like, well, you go figure it out, right? Explaining things to people. So what do they really want to know? Ultimately, in a large corporate structure, everybody reports into the CFO, right? So whoever's signing off your books, the chief financial officer, whoever's reporting to regulators, whoever can, I always say a good barometer, particularly in a bank, is can the person go to jail if we screw up? And having been somebody who could go to jail for a long time if we screwed up, making sure our books are right is a very important thing. And ultimately, they're the ones that control a lot of where the spend goes. Increasingly, you're seeing, particularly in large multinationals, operational governance in terms of regulatory risk is a direct thing. So making sure that the way we're implementing IT and services isn't adding unnecessary, market risk, if there's capital requirements, allocated to that, all those kind of things are more increasingly impacting how we report into the financial officer. Threats to their business, I talked about the impact test. Another great thing to do is look into the market, and if you've got 10, 15 minutes with somebody, which ultimately I think in one meeting is all you'll ever really get, the Knight Capital fiasco that happened, that's probably the most downloaded SEC document, the post-op of that's ever been in the history of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So you can go out and learn what's happened to other people and make sure we know what should we be doing differently now? What should we be doing differently 2 years from now? Most people only operate on a 2-year rotating forecast, if it's even that murky. And then the other thing I always like to try and talk to people about is where are we missing? Where are businesses that our competitors are getting into, or ideas that's what's going to interest them? So I'm flying through this. If you have to talk to a CIO about testing, my advice is to not talk to them about testing, because that's probably the last thing they're interested in and is going to put you in a mind frame of talking shop that they're not going to understand anyway. But it's important to focus on the fact that it's not about you. It's about them and their problems. Know who you're talking to. When I was at Barclays, I gave an orientation to everybody who joined, and I went through every single senior executive in the org chart, and I could tell you who they were, where they went to school, what their specialties were in terms of the business. You start to profile people so that if I ever ran into them, I was already primed to know this is something that Perry's interested in, this is something that's Dan interested in. I can start to prime myself to focus on things that I know are going to help ultimately let me do my job, which is managing the testing team. I want them to have confidence in me that they don't need to worry about that, because I always felt like if my CIO is worried about testing, then I'm screwed. That my job is to worry about testing. Another great piece of advice I'd say is if you're working for a public company or even a private company, pull their internal documents. So if it's a public company, pull their Series 10 from the internet, from your public website, and in that listing is going to have all the threats they've identified to their own business, right? They have to legally, particularly in the US and here in the UK, go through and do a business plan. And you can, if you're not testing for those problems, again, I think that's something that can inform your overall strategy and endear you to people. And listen to those calls. I can't remember the guy who told me this, but it was about a year ago. He said, listen to the public calls. So your CFO has to, on a quarterly basis, give a public accounting of their books. And it's usually not widely publicized, but if you're doing Market Watch or Reuters or Bloomberg, you can find out when those calls are happening. Listen to them, and the questions that analysts, traders, investors are asking your CFO, figure out how you can help your boss or your boss's boss answer those questions, right? That's a great strategy as well for making sure that your test approach is aligned towards your business objectives. And lastly make sure you know what you want before you get into a conversation with them. Repeatedly, I've seen people not follow my two-step model of I want you to know something and I want you to do something, and it quickly devolves into a mess. So lastly, manage your own expectations. There's probably, at my last organization, in the investment bank alone, we had close to 25,000 people in IT, right? That's a lot of folks all vying for the same amount of time for a very small group of people. And if you're going to go in there and complain about, the old soup that's served every Thursday in the cafe, don't expect a great result when people want to listen to you about things they should do. So with that, thank you, and let's go have a beer. Questions?
Does anybody have any questions for Pete?
By the way, my they suck, we suck, you suck model is copyrighted.
At Barclays, when you introduced context-driven testing, did you have to convince a CIO that was a good idea?
We did that in two ways. So I believe in the, I think it was said earlier, I don't need an excuse to do a good job. So part of that was, if you want to, that's a whole other talk, but if you want to introduce context-driven testing in an organization, my advice would be is to, one, start doing it and build up case studies, and then strategically introduce those to people. And you take all that burden on yourself. So like we did a lot of differences around, a lot of changes around how we reported testing. So they would want crappy metrics, scorecards, and all of the other stuff. So we would produce those, but then as well we'd be producing visual models, mind maps, other ways of doing it. So eventually that stuff goes away and we could kill it off, and we would just talk about, we give equal time to different ways of doing things, and eventually people will cut over. But I think there's a better way to test, and you shouldn't need any excuses for how to do that, but doing it at scale, develop case studies before. The worst thing you could do is go to somebody and say, I got a pilot, right? That's a terrible strategy. You should do it first, then tell people. Ask, forgiveness, not permission.
Hi Keith, yeah, fantastic talk. Thanks very much for that. Obviously, you've got your two-step model for when you want to talk to C-level executives and what you want to get out of it. You want them to do something, or what? Have you ever had the situation where the C-level executive wants to talk to you, and what advice you would give in that situation?
Well, it depends why they want to talk to me. My objective was usually, whether it was at Barclays or Citigroup or UBS or any other big banks that I worked at, was that I want to control that agenda. So if they want to talk to me, it hopefully is for something good, right? So I tried to stay out in front of any kind of issues that were happening, but yeah, and the ultimate goal is to get a regular update with them, and you can just keep them up to speed on what's going on. But yeah, I've occasionally been pulled into people's offices to get grilled on things, but you have to be prepared for that as well. Yeah. I don't even know if that remotely answered your question. Mr. McCall. Oh, God.
No, rest easy. Not a question, but an addition. You've put me in mind of a couple of questions that I like to ask when trying to understand what counts as quality around here. And the first question is, so what about this keeps you awake at night? And the second question is, so what about this would get you in the newspapers?
Yeah, absolutely. Those kind of conversations don't happen. I've had countless conversations with CEOs who think their teams are doing agile and couldn't define what that meant. I think the problem is, particularly in large operations, there's just too much. You can't know everything. You don't know what's going on. They've probably got 15 vendors spread across 10 countries. They don't know where their people are. So you have to be very targeted in how you talk to them. Is that it?
I think so.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Keith.